To make a soft slab tumbler, you need to know which orientation your clay block is, because the clay is run through a pug mill, which creates a spiral through the center of the block. So you want to turn your clay bag on its side before you cut a slab off the block. This will help prevent some S-cracks that may form if you cut it in the other orientation. So I'm going to take my wire tool, wrap it around both fingers, and use my fingers actually as a height gauge to control how thick of the slab I'm going to cut. If you'd like to be more precise, you can use wooden spacers. Now, by running the wire tool over the top of the spacers, you know you'll have an even thickness of the slab. The first cut may not be useful though, because that's still the outer surface of the block of clay, so there's going to be some texture and some unevenness in that. So I'm going to go ahead and discard that first cut, and now I'll have a smooth, even thickness slab in the second cut. These spacers are a little more than 1/4 of an inch thick, maybe 3/8. And you could, of course, make spacers of any size, but working with slabs, typically soft slabs, you're going to be trying to work with them rather thin, and you don't need the end result to be any thicker than 1/4 of an inch unless you're doing something unique. So consider making thinner spacers to start with if you're going to go with this method of just cutting your slab off the block. As with all slab work, the less that we torque or distort the slabs before they dry, the less likely they're going to warp in the kiln or in the drying process. So I always try to handle them as little as possible. Now, if you want to cut a lot of slabs, you may consider making yourself a custom tool that will hold the wire at exactly the right height. This could be really simple, just a bent piece of metal or wood and some loops on your wire to hold it in place. Now, since this slab is slightly thicker than the others I cut, I'm going to use it to throw out and stretch this clay into a thinner, longer slab that I can use to make the tumbler. To do this throwing, I'm going to pick it up from the far edge of the slab carefully, tap it gently on the table, and then throw it down again at a 45-degree angle. I showed you this in the soft slab mug tutorial, but it's worth showing you again because this takes a lot of practice to get the touch right. And so always rotate your slab when you're throwing it so you're not overly stretching it in one direction. And just keep practicing until you get the hang of it. If you can't quite get an even slab by throwing, you can always touch it up with the rolling pin. And I find it useful to flip the slab over if I'm going to use the rolling pin, kind of roll it on both sides so I'm not stretching one side more than the other. This can also lead to some warping later. I know I might sound a little paranoid about warping when I'm talking about these slab videos, but there's nothing more frustrating than having something that looks perfect when it goes into the kiln and comes out totally warped or torqued. So that frustration that happens after the firing often begins by working with a slab that's not even, or that you've kind of worked too much, you've distorted it or twisted it when you were moving it around in the soft phase. And you might not notice it, but that tension is still embodied in the clay, and it may not reappear until post-firing. So It's always good to just err on the side of caution and get in the habit of working with your slabs gently and evenly and as lightly as possible. You can also use wooden spacers to control your rolling pin. This is really effective if you're going to be doing a lot of rolling of slabs. You need to have some sort of gauge so that you know exactly the thickness that you want and you can be consistent while making multiple slabs. But also it helps prevent you from having thick spots or thin edges on your slab. So use those wooden spacers if you can. Next, I'm going to take my plaster stamp from the earlier tutorial and I'm going to add some texture to this slab before I make it into a tumbler. I like to use stamps that are generally pretty simple and geometric because there's a whole nother layer of pattern making that happens by using the stamp multiple times and kind of repeating it across a form. So I really enjoy just working with the basic geometric patterns. Now I'm not working off of a template for this design, so I'm just going to freehand cut the slab into roughly the dimensions that I want. If you've made several tumblers and you've come up with a design that you like, then I definitely recommend making yourself a template so that you can repeat that and you can have some consistency across that design. Right now I'm just using this plastic ruler as a guide and I'm going to make a roughly rectangular shape and then I'll see if I like the end result before I go ahead and make a template. So if you're working your slab and you accidentally bend it too much in one direction, and you're worried about that warping coming back to haunt you, just gently bend it in the opposite direction while it's still soft, and hopefully you can kind of neutralize any effects that the clay might remember. If you find that the table or the surface that you're working on is leaving an unpleasant texture, especially on the back side of your slab, you can smooth it out using your rib and just a touch of water. This is especially important if you're working on canvas, as the canvas texture is deeper than a lot of other surfaces and is very recognizable on the finished form. Now I'm actually going to stretch this slab out now after I've texturized it, and so I'm going to tilt this rolling pin a little bit to the upper edge, and that is going to start to erase some of the stamping texture, but what I'm hoping for is kind of a gradient where the stamping texture is still deep on the bottom edge but kind of faded out at the top. So I'm just using this rolling pin to stretch that upper edge, and it's going to be pressing in and erasing the stamping on the bottom side. Looks like it worked. Okay, so I don't have a template, but I am going to use this bottle here to give me a rough form which I can roll this slab around. And since it's a glass bottle, it's non-porous, and so this wet clay slab is going to want to stick to the glass and not release, and it's going to cause all sorts of trouble for me. So I'm just taking a sheet of newspaper and wrapping it around the glass first so that I have this porous surface where I can slide the bottle out from the inside without it sticking to the clay. Using a bottle like that as a form allows me to work with a very thin slab without worrying about distorting it too much. Now that it's standing upright, I need some sort of base. So I'm pulling out my other thin slab and I'm going to trace it with the needle tool. Then I'll cut that out and use that as the base for this tumbler. Again, I like to bevel all the joints on my slab work. It's similar to doing a miter joint in the wood shop. That allows me a little more surface area to attach the two pieces, especially working with these thin slabs. But it also allows me to put some pressure downward onto the base and have that joint stick with that kind of pressure. So I really recommend beveling all of your slab joints. Once it's done, you can give it a little tap and a roll on the table to lift up that edge and really seal down the scoring and slipping. Don't do too much though, because you can see it start to bulge out at the seam there. So I'm just going to make sure that's really well attached and try not to touch it any more than I have to. Once you're satisfied that all the attachments are solid, you can let it dry for a little bit before you do the final cleanup. But you can also just do a quick check and make sure that your scoring and slipping marks on the inside are all disguised and there's no sharp edges to deal with. That's the soft slab tumbler.